In a second, I'll come to you, Jacqueline, because I know that you were very heavily involved in trade unions. But before I do that, it'd be rude not to start with you, given it was Labour speaking out today, Peter. What did you make to some of the things you heard? And specifically, do you think that we need stronger trade unions in this country?
We certainly need stronger trade unions. I thought what Angela Rayner said was pretty sensible. And I've no doubt parts of the press or parts of the Conservative Party will say otherwise. But it's just a fact that there's been attack on trade union rights over the last 13 years or so by various Conservative governments. I'd say a couple of things. First of all, whichever type of trade union you're in, if you end up in industrial action, as I was when I was a newspaper reporter many years ago, you do that out with great reluctance. There's a sense that people in trade unions are, according to some newspapers, rabid militant types. That's not the case. People go on industrial action as a last resort because they care about their readers or their patients or their school kids or their railway passengers and so on, and they give up their pay in doing so. The other point I'd make is that frequently we've seen over the last decade or so, rather than getting round the table and have a negotiation, because there's always disagreements in the workplace, government ministers have tended to bring in new laws, which is what Angela Rayner has pledged today to reverse. For example, you have full employment rights after 2 years rather than 1, and the threshold for a strike ballot is much higher than it used to be. But these are not things that are bringing workers together with government and business and helping the economy grow. They're spiteful attacks by the Conservatives, I'm afraid.
Cool, blimey, spiteful attacks by the Conservatives, Jacqueline. And just before we respond to that, explain a little bit your involvement previously with unions.
Well, when I started flying many, many decades ago, I actually became a shop steward for the Transport and General Workers Union. And at that time, we didn't have pensions. This was the girls. We didn't have any seniority at all. And that was around mid-70s, late 70s, when obviously the Equal Pay Act came about. We obviously moved all of this forward. So I was a negotiator about 3 years. A number of years later, I'd left BA, gone back. And in 1989, a number of us formed a breakaway union called Cabin Crew 89. And I was basically the Deputy General Secretary, and I negotiated for the next 10 years until I became an MEP, the terms and conditions for
So strong history then. So what do you feel now when Peter says essentially a government that you're connected with in some shape or form is essentially doing spiteful attacks on said unions?
Well, it's very typical of the left because they think that anybody that doesn't support the Labour Party necessarily or vote for them has no interest in people's workplaces and their terms and conditions or anything like that. And that couldn't be actually further from the truth, because what most of us know is if you've got a happy group of people working in a company or working in a TV studio, then you're going to get better results and better productivity. The whole point of the trade union reform in the 80s, which was the Thatcher government, was because we had been basically pretty well destroyed this country during the 70s, the winters of discontent and all of those things. And we had a long way to go to try and change that. It was Norman Tebbit that was behind a lot of that reform. And a lot of members of trade unions also supported that because they felt as though they were being dragged into these horrendous situations and very often losing their jobs and industries were closing. And that was why we formed that particular union, which was a non-politically affiliated union. And I was fully behind that. So I do think, I had a look to see what Angela Rayner was saying. And, she said, we'll ban 0-hour contracts. Well, there are a lot of people that like to work on a 0-hour contract because it might suit them. There are all sorts of different flexible contracts that we do have. But if we bring it back to the situation we've had over the last 12 months, for example, with the rail strikes and the RMT, as a former negotiator, you're right, it's not easy negotiating, but by the same token, I am in despair at the RMT and really what's going on with the railways and also with the NHS. We have minimum service levels across other European countries to make sure.
But do you back these new anti-strike, what people are calling anti-strike laws?
I don't believe that they're anti-strike laws at all.
And Labour, to your point, Rayner, she says basically in the first 100 days they're going to get rid of them.
Yeah, we're not talking about Thatcher reforms. We're talking about getting rid of changes introduced in the last 10 years or so. So very briefly, the minimum service level is basically an attempt to criminalise workers who are participating in industrial action.
No, it's not.
By making it harder for people to kind of opt out of the workplace, which they're doing.
Where's the criminal? She's saying that's not what it is.
Not what it is.
they'll make it against the law.
No, you've said they were going to attempt to criminalise people, not performing minimum service. Where's the criminalisation bit? Who's going to get done?
Because if you fail to turn up to work, you'll be breaking the law.
And what will happen to you? You think,
Well,
you're going to have all these people in prison? Is he spot on with what he's saying?
That would be remarkable if we end up in prison. But very briefly, I'll go to Jacqueline. I think it is being subject to challenge in the courts prior to by the unions.
They're entitled to challenge anything. At the end of the day, we were looking at minimum service levels when you're looking at the NHS and you're looking at critical services. Now, we're all very happy that the police don't go on strike, thank goodness. We're very happy that the armed forces don't go on strike and they end up having to bail us out in various situations. And I do not believe it's acceptable.
But that's because they can't. So if they could, they probably would.
No, that's only because it would be illegal for them to do so. Now, we're not saying, and I'm not saying, that other areas like the NHS and other big organisations shouldn't have the right to strike. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying and what we've been trying to do is at least ensure that there are minimum service standards, there's minimum cover, like they have in other countries across Europe and across the world, to ensure if there is industrial action, that the public do not suffer, that their lives are not in danger. And that is what the minimum service levels mean.
What about this 0 hours contract thing? Because as Jacqueline was just saying, there's talk about scrapping them. But if someone wants to work on a 0 hours contract, they've already got rid of the... before, what they used to do is if you was on a 0 hours contract, they used to prohibit you from going anywhere else to try and top up your hours, which absolutely was appalling if you ask me. Anyway, you can't really do that anymore. So these 0 hour contracts, they're for people that, for whatever reason, they might be studying or they might have caring responsibilities or whatever, so the flexibility is valued. Why is it therefore for a government then to say, actually, no, you can't do that anymore?
Well, my understanding, Michelle, is that it's not a total scrapping, it's a ban on certain types. I'm happy to be corrected.
Well, it says here that the new deal for working people, so this is what the proposals are called, would include protections against unfair dismissal, their words, not mine, a ban on 0 hour contracts, more flexible working, and ending the principle of fire and rehire, which is basically when people try and get rid of all their workforce and then rehire them pretty much 5 minutes later on different T's and C's. So as I understand it, that is what they would be trying to do, get rid of that 0 hour concept and principle.
To be frank, I'd be amazed if that would happen, for the reasons you rightly outlined, that there's a small proportion of workers that like that flexibility. Often it's people studying or maybe working for temporary periods or got caring responsibilities. Very briefly, you made the point that exclusivity is a bad thing, where an old employer used to say, you can only work for us and only be 10 hours a week. That would be unfair, but allowing some room for flexibility under some types of 0 hours contracts, I think there probably is a little bit of a case for that.
I've got to say, I've spoken to a lot of carers for various reasons recently, and what I found pretty appalling is sometimes they work on these flexible contracts, which is fair enough, but then they're only getting paid when they arrive at the job. So I don't know, they're pedalling on their bikes or whatever it is, and they arrive at the person's home, and then that's when the timesheet essentially starts work. So it doesn't take into account all of their travel. I think that is pretty unfair, don't you? So do you think that Labour are the party to get a hold of the workers' rights in this country and make it better, make work pay for people?
But they were paid like that when they were in power. That's not changed in the last 13 years of carers.
Well,
carers that were going around local authorities and they were not being paid to travel from A to B. That's nothing new. That's not being brought out by...
It's not right, though, is it?
I completely agree with you. I think that there should be a far better way of making sure that they're paid for the time they take to go from one patient to another. I think
Michelle's point was that the usage of that has increased a lot more, and it will only increase further with an ageing
Well, I
population.
don't believe that's the case at all.
I just think it's pretty damn... I just think it's pretty damn shameful.
The Blair government could have changed that. They were in power for 13 years. They didn't.
Well, I blame it on all of them, quite frankly. Yeah. I think, why is the society, whoever's in power, I don't really care, quite frankly. I'm not wedded to them in that way, but why don't we value our carers as a society? It's one of the hardest things that we can do for people physically, often having to lift people, I don't know, however many times your size, your weight and all the rest of it, do really personal things for people, and we give people minimum wage.
Yeah.
I mean, what is wrong with our society?